Hello, world. Welcome to the Way of the Psychonauts weekly live stream. My name is Mitch Schultz, and I am joined by producer and director Susan Hess. Logeais. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Mitch. So today I'm really excited because we have Stan Grof's brother, Paul Grof, joining us today. And we were not able to interview Paul until after we were done editing the documentary, which made me really sad because towards the end of our interview, Paul has a really wonderful story to tell about just sort of the miracle of Stan's life and how, despite all the things that might have kept him from pursuing his career, and Paul as well, things just seemed to work out. But in addition to that, and prior to that, Paul shares how they approached psychology from two very different perspectives, and yet they end up pretty much at the same point of view, which is sort of the mystery of consciousness and where it originates, or where do our thoughts come from? How do we manifest our worldviews? So anyway, he explains it really well. And I am looking forward to sharing our interview with you. I'll pass it off to Mitch.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, and to also keep with kind of our themes and to acknowledge and consider everything that's going on right now around the planet. Obviously, it's a very transformational moment for all of humanity. With huge systemic challenges that we face. And we want to try to find some ways to be different in the world. And I think that's part of our discussion today and part of the ongoing discussion. So I just wanted to reference that and just do a brief description of the video here in Paul's interview that you're getting ready to watch. So in this video, Paul Grof explains how he and Stan chose different paths. Paul focused on the biological causes of mental illness, while Stan focused on the psychological causes. Eventually, though, his research into mood disorders brought him to the same conclusion as his brother. Consciousness is the ground of all being, and the ability to integrate awareness of subtle dimensions determines how well someone functions in life. The case histories he describes bring attention to the problems of misdiagnosis and medications that can cause more harm than good. Paul also recounts the synchronicities that align to keep Stan out of prison and make possible their medical careers. So without further ado, here's Paul Grof's interview. See you soon.
Our research and Stan's research really started in completely different ways, almost in the opposite ends. And it's so interesting that now I think we can see, after many years, how they confluence together in terms of covering different aspects of how non-ordinary states of consciousness develop, how they unfold, what's behind the process. Stan really started with the kind of psychological model, psychological paradigm. We were, for kind of unexpected reasons, around 1962, Stan and I ended up in the same research institute. That's something to do with the political situation. They opened up new institute. People had to have apartment in Prague. There were very few psychiatrists there. So despite being kind of politically undesirable, they accepted us into the institute, first Stan and then myself. And
Welcome to the Way of the Psychonauts weekly live streams. My name is Mitch Schultz, and I'm joined by my co-host, Susan Hess. Hi, Susan.
Hello, Mitch, and hello, everybody. So today we're going to have Stan Grof's brother, Paul Grof, join us, and he will be speaking about his work, which Mitch will describe in more detail. But I just want to say that we weren't able to interview Paul until after we were done editing the documentary, which is a shame because he tells a story that's really interesting about their years in Czechoslovakia. And also, I think it's really interesting that we had Robin Carhart Harris previously talking about the impact of psychedelics on brain function. And now we have Paul who will be discussing mood disorders. And again, brain function and what happens when there are certain peaks of activity in the brain. So the parallels are very interesting, and I think there's still a lot to be understood, but it's fascinating what Paul has to share.
Great. Well, before I describe the video, I do want to acknowledge, to kind of keeping with our themes, and also in consideration of everything that is happening around the world right now, this is a transformational moment for all of humanity, and the systemic challenges that are affecting all of us right now are driving us, I think, to seek new ways of being on this planet, with each other, with ourselves even. So we want to kind of send out our love to everybody as we're going through these times, and we'll look forward to kind of bringing that stuff back into our conversation when we come back after Paul's interview. So, all right. So in this video, Paul Grof explains how he and Stan chose different paths. Paul focused on the biological causes of mental illness, while Stan focused on the psychological causes. Eventually, though, his research into mood disorders brought him to the same conclusion as his brother. Consciousness is the ground of all being, and the ability to integrate awareness of subtle dimensions determines how well someone functions in life. The case histories he describes brings attention to the problems of misdiagnosis and medications that can cause more harm than good. Paul also recounts the synchronicities that align to keep Stan out of prison and make possible both of their medical careers. Without further ado, here is Paul Grof's video from The Way of the Psychonaut. Thank you.
Our research and Stan's research really started in completely different ways, almost in the opposite ends. And it's so interesting that now I think we can see, after many years, how they confluence together in terms of covering different aspects of how non-ordinary states of consciousness develop, how they unfold, you know, what's behind the process. Stan really started with the kind of psychological model, psychological paradigm. We were, for kind of unexpected reasons, around 1962, Stan and I ended up in the same research institute. It had something to do with the political situation. They opened up new institute. People had to have apartment in Prague. There were very few psychiatrists there. So despite being kind of politically undesirable, they accepted us into the institute, first Stan and then myself. And I started with child psychiatry. The director of that particular department did not vote for the right person, was kicked out, and I had to move somewhere, so they moved me into psychopharmacology. So here is Stan, you know, starting his work with the psychological model. The assumption, briefly, that the sources of emotional problems are in the early childhood and the traumatic experiences that one has throughout life, but essentially, you know, very early in childhood get repressed. Whereas I ended up in the psychopharmacology department, and there, of course, the assumption was that emotional disorders, psychiatric disorders, have essentially chemical imbalance, biological abnormality underlying it. And these were completely separate issues. Stan in the psychotherapeutic department had the major advantage that LSD at that time was part of the pharmacopoeia. The psychiatrist, if you get proper training and at 5 supervised sessions, you could actually use it for the benefit of the patients, and for a number of them benefited. So we started from these two different angles, and now, 5-6 decades later, you can see that we actually, in terms of the findings, they offer kind of complementary explanation of the process of non-ordinary states. Stan, I think, more in terms of what the content is, the experiential content, how it can be utilized properly for personal growth and healing. And our research, based on a completely different problem, different material, really people with severe, or people with different kinds of mood disorders, moderately severe, very severe, and offering better understanding of the propensity that the brain or the biological processes create for the experience of non-ordinary states, how they unfold, what the intensity is, and eventually why the content doesn't seem to come from the known brain structures. So Stan really proceeded with the psychotherapeutic work, first, of course, inducing the non-ordinary states using the psychedelics, LSD, other psychedelics, and later, because of the political situation and the psychedelics being illegal, developing holotropic breath work. And then gradually became clear why the usual psychotherapeutic work is so often ineffective if you just try to intellectually understand, retrieve some of the traumatic material and intellectually understand it. Because it turns out that there were other dimensions. There's the perinatal dimensions. Of course, that initially was very controversial, and then even more difficult to grasp the transpersonal dimension, which some of the experiences are even not easy to translate into verbal expression. But when that became clear, then it was clear that the content of non-ordinary states is really has very multi-dimensional determination and comes from multi-level situation. Now, what we were doing is we were studying these patients with recurrent mood disorders, completely different kind of type of material. And the first thing was, of course, when I saw how these episodes of depression in so many people keep coming back and back, the question was, how can you stop it? What can you do about it? And we tried a number of different things. And in the process, it became obvious that if you want to do something to change the illness, first of all, you need to know how it's actually running untreated, because that's the only way you can clearly evaluate whether you change something with treatment. So in an international collaboration, we collected data from over 1,300 patients, lifelong. And the kind of main thrust behind this was Professor Gilles Engst from Zurich. And then we together, and later myself, spent several decades trying to understand what is the pattern, what is behind this unusual pattern of particularly the depressions coming back. Because sometimes it's very frequent, sometimes people have 2 or 3 episodes, sometimes it happens just at the end of woman's adolescence and then hits them again. It's just puzzling. No statistical methods succeeded, whatever we tried, until in collaboration with neurophysiologists, Dr. Lat and Anna Yamamotova, it became obvious that these patterns are patterns that both humans and animals have in the brain, that the brain essentially is a complex system, and it has oscillatory processes at all levels, at the neuronal level, at the level of neuronal networks, at the level of complex neuronal effects, for example, sleep, and the whole brain. And you can then see that these episodes, illness, follow the pattern. We saw it for the first time in the most severe patients, because there it was obvious that as you have the pattern, then at the peaks of these oscillatory patterns, when the activity in the brain is very high, in other words, imagine what the activity I'm just thinking about the rush hour in San Francisco. What happens? There's just too much activity and things stop. So this is similar, I think, for depression, the simplest kind of analogy, that you have too much activity in the brain, the oscillation is very high, and the mind cannot function normally, starts getting into non-ordinary states. And in our observations, these were primarily depressions or manic episodes. And generally speaking, of course, these processes vary, and there are, for most of us, one does not have mood disorder, these processes are adaptive. They will change depending on your biological and mental activity and sleep. The rhythms will shift. But for some reason, probably partly tied with genetics, the people who have distinct recurrent mood disorders have problem with the feedback mechanism where the oscillation is supposed to, when it comes to the ceiling of that particular person, is supposed to turn down back into normal oscillation, and it doesn't. And so these people then, if this is severe illness, will experience episodes at the end. But for most people, and that's what makes the illness and the treatment so challenging, it depends on other factors, psychosocial factors, stresses in life, biological stresses, psychological stresses, whether at the peak the activity turns down or gets above the ceiling, above the top, and then people start experiencing non-ordinary states. And then there are some non-ordinary states of consciousness, at least in my definition, that 99% people at least experience. That's falling in love. No, it's a magic. It's probably the most magical experiences in life. But at the same time, it does have certain biological correlates, hormone correlates, oscillatory correlates. Tends to happen particularly around the peak, based on the measurements that we've done on our patients, and they describe their experiences. Or spiritual emergency, usual emergence is happening around these times. And when you, for example, do holotropic breath work, we worked with, for 2.5 years, also with a group of people who did not have any history of emotional problems. And yet you could see how they had intense peak experiences at the time when the tests were showing that their oscillatory processes were at the high peak. So that's the relationship I would describe between what's happening in the brain, that it does create propensity. Now, you can see that this kind of oscillatory processes, of course, anytime a person takes, for example, LSD or most other psychedelics, that the experience actually comes in waves. First, kind of a small wave, bit of a waiting, then larger waves. Eventually, you get immersed in the emergence of the experience, and then, when you're coming out of it, again, it's gradually waves with greater distance between the episodes, and eventually the flashbacks, which is a fascinating experience, because at that time the pharmacological activity maybe out of the system for weeks, for months, but the oscillatory system still kind of responds to the activation that it experiences before. So that's one thing where I think our and Stan's work confluences in a meaningful way. The propensity for non-ordinary states that's created by the brain, by the non-local activity that's created by the local, or that it's the condition is created by the local activity. The other interesting way where Stan's and I think our observation come together had something to do with work with the families that we've been doing. And as it often happens in science, we started for the wrong reason. We thought these kind of bipolar disorders, the classical manic depressive illness, they traditionally cluster in families. So we just do a year of genetics and we're going to have clear genes. Now this is 30, 35 years later. There are some genes, but it's certainly nowhere near to help us in identifying these problems. But we ended up, in the area where I have been working, Ottawa and Toronto, there are still large families. So you think that they have not heard about pill because we have some families with 12, 14, 16 children. And of course, for this kind of work, it's very illustrative. And so what happens, sometimes we have families where over the 40 years we've seen over 100 members from the family. Some of them had emotional problems, number of them haven't. But when you treat those who didn't require help, everything suggests that they have the same biological abnormality involved in the process. They respond to the same antidepressants, they fail on the same types of medications, they have the same type of clinical course of illness, and most important, they respond well to the same type of mood stabilizer and fail on others. So there's good reasons to believe, and there are some biological measurements that suggest that they have similar biological propensity. Yet when you look at the type of emotional experiences, the diagnostic sets that are described, they vary greatly. Of course, there has to be at least one patient with bipolar illness because that's how we got the family in the first place. But the variety of problems is very different. And when probably the largest amount of work that we did over the past 5 decades was trying to figure out the biological abnormalities in these conditions. And there are many when people are severely depressed or manic. Manic is, of course, more difficult to measure because you get collaboration. But there's a number of biological changes in many systems. Certainly, some of it now appears to be related particularly to synaptic and postsynaptic activity, and the G protein activity related to the oscillatory processes and connectivity, conductivity in the brain. But from what we've seen so far, all these abnormalities are of the same quality, whether the patient gets depressed or manic. In the briefest possible way, whether the patient is or the person is experiencing hell or heaven. And so that suggests that while the propensity is connected with some of the biological qualities, the actual experience is coming from somewhere else, non-local. And if one tries to connect it conceptually in some way, if I try to explain where it explain for myself, it is congruent to some of the findings from hard sciences during the 20th century that suggest that there's a complexity in everything, that there are a number of fields that are existing around us and still have not been identified. And so possibly this non-local experiential activity may have more to do with the fields around the brain rather than the biological nature of the brain. So it's been a fascinating journey because we started, Stan and I started with conceptually two completely different set of assumptions. And I guess despite our assumptions, it ended up with a set of findings that seems to complement each other.
The patterns of oscillation can linger after a psychedelic experience, resulting in a flashback that might occur months after the taking of the substance. And I'm not sure if I heard you say this, but the idea that taking a psychedelic might open or condition the brain to a susceptibility or a facility, a greater ease of accessing non-ordinary states of consciousness, such as shamanic journey work, the ability to imagine yourself rising up into another dimension and connecting with other spirits because you've seen something. It's you sort of forged a path.
Yes, yeah. No, I assume that's the case, and that would certainly fit my observations. Also, that kind of changed perspective that you have after those experiences makes it possible to transform yourself or start the transformation process in the direction that you want to go, that you want to develop yourself. But the interesting thing is, it depends what you do with the experience, and I think it's very important to have somebody that you can discuss the experience with and integrate it. Because I've seen people having incredible mystical experiences as part of their illness, and they come out and they don't want to talk about it, and it doesn't change anything in their life. So it depends what you have to still integrate it in some way. We have much to learn. You know, this is still a very new area, and while I think people have been now in the past decades bringing in neuroscience into transpersonal areas and trying to understand it, but unfortunately I think they're still asking mainly very mechanistic questions. We have to change our concepts to accommodate some of these things. But the observations would certainly suggest that meditation can achieve that. And certainly, you know, Katharis's observations are very much compatible with what I'm saying, that the increased connectivity happens at the peak of the oscillatory processes. There is a increased amount of activity taking place, and therefore much more connected activities through the brain. So yes, I agree, but we still have, on the observational level, I agree. In terms of proving these things, we still have much to do.
And it makes me think also of, you mentioned these dimensions of awareness or fields that exist that we're not aware of or that we don't interact with. And it reminds me of martial arts or something I studied called spatial dynamics, which is being aware of the space between matter, which we are mostly space. If we took all the space out of our bodies, we'd be the size of a grain of salt.
Yes.
And so cultivating awareness of these fields and practicing interaction with them.
Yes, yes. No, it is space, and the interesting thing is, yes, if we just took the matter, we would be just a grain of salt, but the grain of salt would every 10 years change.
Yeah. No, it constantly evolving and shifting. Yeah, so I just feel like humanity as a species has so much possibility for growth and practicing And I think the techniques for accessing these fields exist.
Yes.
But we, in our Western industrialized culture, have just sort of pushed them aside.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I, should acknowledge that although I clearly started from different basis and different set of assumptions than Stan, certainly the regular contact with him opened me up to a number of other possibilities that probably I would not have seen otherwise.
And you were his sitter for his first LSD. Can you describe your perspective of that?
Yeah. The lesson from that is you don't understand how significant every moment in life is. You only see it in retrospect. I had no idea what this is going to be like. And when I now come to some of the celebrations of Stan's works, like several years back at the university or last night, and suddenly realize the impact and where it started, you just don't realize at the moment what's going to germinate from that. Psychiatry really started, and the basic concepts are a century old, before electricity. At that time, when you ended in the loony bin, it was because you were completely non-functional. If you were a bit depressed, family would keep you home. You really had to be very mad to end up in the hospital. So it would make sense then if you have non-functional person, that you use the experiences and say, this is the mental illness. Well, he saw Maria, Jesus, or he thought he was Napoleon, and so that's the illness. But in fact, when you do that, today you find out that the symptoms, people can experience practically anything. All depends what they do with it, what happens afterwards. That's the illness. I mean, Elmer Green, have you met Elmer? No, this developer of biofeedback. He was clearly hallucinating, but it was in such a constructive way that it was giving him completely new ideas for research. We find when we work with the families, sometimes you have a relative who is actually, in a way, symptom-wise sicker than the patient who came, but never identified themselves, never felt suffering. It's 100 years ago, it made sense in that context, consider mental illness based on what people experience. Today, it doesn't. It's difficult to comment on schizophrenia because it's a family of different problems that have in common that people kind of fairly frequently or chronically experience, stay in non-ordinary states and don't come back. But it's a variety of problems. Some of it, I'm sure, will later turn out to be some organic problems in the brain, like some of the hysterias used to be. 10 years later, you start having some neurological symptoms. Turns out that something is falling apart in the brain. And 1/3 are just very episodic. There are 2 people who developed the concept of schizophrenia. One was Bleuler in Zurich, and one was Kreppelin in Munich. And I have the data from Bleuler, and 1/3 of his schizophrenics were actually, they looked like manic depressives. They had episodic, they were really remitting pretty much from their illness. So it's a variety of problems, and so it's hard to make a generalized statement about that.
Can you describe it briefly? What was the understanding that you came away with?
Well, first of all, that if you use intuitive consensus, you can get a lot of variable information. That the best intuitives that I've worked with were usually right in about 75%. and the 25% they were getting wrong information, and they could not tell the difference because they have to be confident that the information is all correct. And when you take the information from number of them, like we worked with 6 at the same time, then you reduce hugely the number of wrong information. And in the overlap, we got a lot of fascinating information about how to measure neuroendocrine functions in mood disorders. They came with 6-methoxy-melatonin. It was just amazing things from people who had no experience, no medical knowledge, and so on. Now, about astrology, they said that we should really focus on chart at the conception, that the birth chart is kind of a poor representative of, because it's hard to find the time conception, but ideally you should really look on conception, that's where the things are happening important, and that fits with what some of the mystics described, that it's really the moment of conception where the decision of the universe really decides with a split of a second where the soul ends. One very important factor in all this is that if you actually identify the oscillatory pattern that's running in the brain of a particular patient, then you can really improve markedly treatment. So, for example, if somebody has a particular type of bipolar illness, kind of classical type that runs in episodes, clusters in families, doesn't have comorbidity, these people are fortunate that they can get well on lithium. They can stabilize, and we have 30 years follow-ups. You can see they stabilize as long as they take correct medication. Things are fine. They may decide to adjust and see whether they can use more their resources, reduce lithium. But the problem is the side effects. And what we are finding, and I have not yet completed the analysis because it's difficult to find exact corresponding control group. But what is coming out, that for example, after 10 or 15 years of lithium treatment without interruption, there's no effect on the kidneys, no problem. But after that, gradually lithium starts influencing particularly the ability to get rid of waste in the kidneys. And we have now a fair number of people who have been on lithium 35, 40, 45 years, and I see how their kidney function has been badly affected. Now, fortunately, we have good reserves. We have 2 kidneys and good reserves, but still, it should not be happening. The advantage is, if it's a patient whose bipolar illness is severe enough that they have identifiable oscillatory pattern, we have set it up in such a way that we treat them only when when the peak is likely to come, and when there is no peak for a longer period of time, we take them off lithium, and these patients don't show any side effects. It seems like the side effects, both the kidneys and the other effects that are not as common and important but are still there and troubling patients, tremor, diarrhea, and other things, none of this happens if you can interrupt the treatment for a certain period of time. So even after 30, 35 years, there's just no demonstrable effect on the kidneys. These are preliminary data, but they are very convincing for me. In a way, I find that that's probably one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the oscillatory pattern, if you can predict and prove that the prediction works.
Well, and doesn't lithium also, when someone takes lithium, is it sedating in some way? Does it diminish their, interaction with the world around them? Is that ever something that occurs?
Yes, if the dosage is wrong or if it's given to the wrong patient. It does not happen. Lithium somehow favors the classical bipolar illness, and those patients generally tell you that they feel like they are not taking anything. If it's the right of type and the right dosage correctly. Unfortunately, lithium, when it came out, it was such a success because you had a number of patients who have been in the hospital 20 times, who had 200 electroshocks, and suddenly you would put them on lithium and they were fine for a year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. So people started giving it to anybody with abnormal moods. And that, of course, then you have significant side effects and significant problems. But as long as it's the right patient and the right dosage, no, it's a medication that's very well tolerated. After all, we all have some lithium in the body. In the treatment, you just increase considerably the concentration.
Was it frightening when he was arrested? Were you home
very
when they
frightening,
came?
yes. Yeah. It was very frightening.
Can you describe what happened? He said they just showed up and ransacked the apartment?
Yeah. But the interesting thing was they allowed us to stay, in the apartment while they were ransacking it. And they just went through absolutely everything. It's when you look back, you wonder whether somebody wrote the story, because there were so many unusual circumstances. I can go for a second, go back to when he took the LSD first time. The fact that the boss who gave him LSD was fascinated with stroboscopic light. This is incredible because this magnified so much the experience for him and directed it into the universe. How does that happen? And similarly, he was of the 15 guys, because I also went to the courts, and so of the 15 guys who were arrested and interrogated and tortured, he was the only one who was let go, and all other got hard labor, 10 years, and the reason was that, I don't know whether he talked about that, but he said when they came and found it, this leaflet on the balcony, he said that he hid it there because he thought it was a pornography and he never opened it. And he just stayed with that story. And because this was 1949 and it was the first year after the communists took over, they still tried to pretend that there is a bit of law, so that if the lawyer kind of insisted on that, they just let him go, put him just on a 10-year probation. But he was the only one from the group who was let go, So, and then these kind of things continued. He was kicked out of the school, but put in a different school, and they obviously took them like 2 years to transfer the fact that he was in jail. And then the guy who was the director got ill at the time. He would have never gotten to medical school. I would have never gotten to medical school. We don't know. These were just such coincidences. Yeah. When I was applying for medical school, there was like 3,000 applicants, and there were 20 committees. And again, to pretend that there is still something, one of the committees got a non-communist professor, and it turned out it was a friend of our parents from their childhood. You know, it's just you just wonder how these things happen.
Well, I love the story of getting the gold medal for his experience.
Yes, yeah.
By President Gottwald.
Yes.
It's funny. Yeah. Stan found the image of those gold coins and insisted that I put those in the movies.
Yeah, no, that obviously, got him into medical school, and when they found out that he was, it was like a year later. It became extremely embarrassing for the dean to admit that they haven't properly checked the background, so they let him continue medical school. It's such an unusual set of coincidences. You wonder who writes the stories.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Way of the Psychonauts community screenings and live streams. We hope you enjoyed Paul Grof's interview, and hopefully has inspired some questions and some thought that we can ask him about shortly. Before we dive into that Q&A, let Susan do a proper introduction. So the floor is yours, Susan.
All right. So Paul Grof is a Canadian research psychiatrist, clinician, and administrator. Dr. Grof has been involved in transpersonal activities since 1962 and utilized holotropic breath work with major depressions and bipolar disorders. He has collaborated on numerous international clinical and research initiatives in the area of mood disorders. In addition to his work in North America and Europe, he has worked in the National Institute of Mental Health in the USA and at World Health Organization, Geneva. From 1988 to 2005, he was clinical director of the Royal Ottawa Hospital and later director of mood disorders research there. Presently, he is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto and director of Ottawa Mood Disorders Center. He has co-authored and authored over 500 publications and 3 books. He participates in the website mdco.ca and has a YouTube channel. Welcome, Paul. And before we start with questions, I know you have some slides to illustrate the information that you shared in our interview.
Yes, I would very much like to do that because I feel that what I talked about in response to your questions was a lot of theory, and it should be illustrated by a couple of images. If we can get them going.
Got it. Go ahead and just, I think Stephen will bring those up. So if you want to just go ahead and start on your first slide, we'll pull that in, Paul.
Well, essentially, on the first slide, I talk about the fact that Stan's findings and our research complement each other in terms of understanding the non-ordinary states of consciousness and their genesis. And essentially, we'll use kind of 3 points to show that once we have the slides going. But
we just got the slides up now.
I don't think you can see them, Paul, but the people that are watching can. We won't see them on our Zoom window. Yeah.
Well, that makes it a bit tricky.
Well, I think they'll go in order if you...
Okay, well, essentially, I want to point out that these findings complement each other. And we can go on the first slide. I'm using 3 examples. The first example is an example from the studies of large families that we did. About 35 years ago, we started working with families in order to collect genetic information. We were working with people with mood disorders, and the manic depressive illness clusters in families. And so when we had the first 1,000 people together, it was striking how the clustering patterns. And so we thought we're going to get into genetics, and in a year we're going to have some genes for manic depressive illness. Now, this is 35 years later. We've got some indications of such genes, but as it often happens, other things came out. And one of the things that came out is, and hopefully you can see that on the slide, is that in these large families, we had up to 100 people in some of these families. And on the example, you can see a family that came to us because of one patient with manic depressive illness. Now, we then, over the years, investigated and treated everybody who had some emotional difficulties and got as much as information or interviews from people who are well. And there is a lot of information that shows that the underlying biological dysfunction is the same in all people who are not well. In other words, the course of illness is the same, episodic, subchronic, chronic, regardless of what kind of problems they eventually respond to the same mood stabilizer, like in this family, for example, lithium. But they would fail if we try them on lamotrigine or neuroleptics or other types of stabilizers. They would do well on the same type of antidepressant. They would fail on other antidepressants, and so on. And the biological studies, when they were possible, were indicating that all the people have the same kind of biological dysregulation. Yet they have completely different, when they go into non-ordinary states, it has completely different content, it has completely different DSM label also, the DSM, the psychiatric Bible. So that suggests to me, it's compatible with the idea that the experience is not coming from the brain, it needs to come from outside. I think the second slide, the next one, I'm trying to think what is there on the second slide. There are the biological differences. And you can see what there were about 20 biological abnormalities that have been found in these mood disorders and replicated and so on. But when you look at the findings in experiences as different as heaven and hell, as different as mania and depression, they are all in the same direction. Yes, there are abnormalities, but they are all in the same direction. So that does not support the idea that these experiences are generated from the brain. And then the next set of slides relates to the question of oscillation. And this, I think, explains to us the timing and the intensity of non-ordinary states. We all have these oscillating processes in the brain. Now, brain is enormous oscillator. There are oscillatory processes on all levels, at the levels of neuron, at the levels of regions, at the levels of networks, at the levels of the whole brain. However, and this is happening because the brain is a complex system and has to deal with a number of different inputs. Now, we all have these oscillations in the brain, but it turns out that when somebody has manic depressive illness, the oscillations become relatively regular. People who don't have these problems, the oscillations will adjust depending on your level of activity, level of mental satisfaction. And they can be, for example, in athletes, you can train them for top events when they need to be really on. But it turns out, looking at the patients with bipolar disorders, this is not the case. And I think there is slide then that shows one patient with bipolar disorders and the episodes throughout 25 years. And when you look at it, you cannot see any pattern. It seems very irregular, very haphazard. But when you move to the next slide, then you see that when you understand the oscillatory pattern, the exponential oscillatory pattern, which is on the top of the episodes, that actually the rhythm is explainable. The episodes only did not happen on 2 occasions when the woman was pregnant, and it turns out that the pregnancy has very protective effect against this abnormal activity in the brain. And so we spent I really started studying the course of these disorders, and in international collaboration we got together a collection of lifelong stories from over 1,300 people. And again, then we tried to analyze for 35 years different statistical methods, couldn't find anything until we connected with 2 prominent neurophysiologists, Dr. Joseph Ladd and Dr. Anna Yamamotova, who were familiar with all these patterns of oscillatory behavior in animal brain. And it turned out that it's quite applicable to humans. And on that basis, in the most severe patients, we could see that they had episode at every peak of this oscillation. Of course, for most patients, that's not the case. And that's why it's so difficult to sort out, because there, at the peak, they are at risk for an episode. But it depends on what other things are happening in their life, psychologically, nutritionally, stress-wise, whether this peak turns into an episode or not. And I think the last slide there, I'm trying to point out that this actually makes it possible to treat patients with severe mental illness intermittently. That you can, if you see on the top, there are the episodes of illness as they happened. And you can see below that when lithium was started, that whenever they had a peak of oscillatory activity and were on the medication, the episode did not happen. On the other hand, on the right, when you see 2 red arrows, below that, the patient did not follow the advice. They got busy, they got traveling, they did not go back to lithium as prescribed, and they had again full episodes. And on the right-hand side, finally you see the blue arrow. And under that arrow, you can see that when we knew that the patient will not have any of the peaks, we were able to keep the woman off medication for 1.5 years, stayed well, and we had to, of course, resume then lithium afterwards. So I tried to, this is a Reader's Digest summary of about 5 decades of work. And I'm just very grateful, Susan, to you, because it was last spring that you came with this idea of an interview. And although we talked with Stan about these things many times, I was forced to kind of systematize it and put it down into these 3 points that which show that although Stan and I started from a very different point, very different assumptions, one about psychological, the other one about biological nature of non-ordinary states, people usually live through their life just to confirm their original assumptions. That's how most of science develops. This, surprisingly, has been such a trip that the data forced us to bring things together. And of course, I have to make it very clear that this is in the context of huge amount of other information that confirms that there is non-local consciousness, not only tied up with brain, but also primarily tied with non-local consciousness. And that's, I think, where we have to search for the content and experiences of non-ordinary states. But one has to, when you try to understand this, you have to take into consideration all the advances in hard sciences that happened during the 19th century, from quantum physics all the way to modern biology. You have to add to it all the work from parapsychology, experimental work from parapsychology. I want to make it clear that I'm seeing these observations in that context.
Yeah, and that's wonderful. Thank you for clarifying that, Paul. I'm going to jump very quickly and apologize for my dog, who was having a nightmare when I was introducing you. So this is the challenge of doing things at home, and I will not let my
state.
He was a non-ordinary. He was probably running and chasing another dog in a dream. And I love that you are considering these research into quantum physics, the idea of dimensions or fields that exist within which information is held, and that we're accessing that information, and so that it's not a product of the brain. I'm really excited to hear that. And this may be totally off topic, but in reviewing our interview prior to this conversation today, I was reminded of your work with intuitives. And I wondered what caused you to look toward that as a possible source of clarity for what you were finding.
Oh, it was another synchronicity. Probably 1978, 79, I get an email from Bill Kautz, who was at that time in San Francisco. And he was an engineer, an engineer who worked in the Stanford Research Institute, then retired and became very interested, probably because of the work there were several people working on remote viewing in Stanford Institute, and became very interested. And so he started exploring different issues, and he wanted to, there was a Slovak scientist who was very much into astrology, and he claimed that he was able to predict the gender of the future baby from astrological measurements. And Bill Kautz wanted me, because of the language, wanted me to connect with him. So I did, but we started, talking about other things, what he's doing. And he was telling me about, he set up this Institute of Applied Intuition in San Francisco. And I was telling him that we have this huge problem in studying abnormal moods, because at that time, so many new theories spread suddenly and sprang out. And I said, how the hell, with limited resources, do you decide which way to go? And he said, well, it's very simple. There are intuitives. And he had a very interesting idea. Through electrophysiology, I worked with Elmer Green, and I came across to some intuitives there, because it turned out that people who have the extra ability to control the internal states that normally are not supposed to be controlled, such as blood pressure, heart rate, body temperature. There were people who could actually stop their heart for 15 seconds. And it turned out that these people were also very intuitive. So I was not unfamiliar when Bill told me about this. And I told him, well, that's very nice, but the best intuitives I encountered, they were 25% wrong. They were 75% right, which is fantastic, but still 25% completely wrong. And they could not tell what was right because they have to be convinced that the information that's coming out is correct, and they cannot differentiate. So he came with that idea that if you have 6 or 7 intuitives, if you start multiplying the 25% wrong, it of course gets less and less. So eventually, what comes out of 6 intuitives, then there's a very high 99% likelihood that this is correct. And so we then set up a study that we published later in Transpersonal Psychology, where we tested the different hypotheses and different ideas in mood states, and got just amazing results. There were, for example, we wanted to know how to proceed with neuroendocrinology. That was at that time considered window on the brain, but it was very expensive. And so we needed to have the cleanest technology. And these people, for example, could tell us that we are doing it wrong, that what we should. And these were 6 people who had nothing to do with medicine, nothing to do with. One was like an owner of a motel outside of San Francisco. One was an engineer. But they came up with incredible ideas. For example, they told us, if you really want to measure the pineal activity, you have to use 6-methoxy melatonin, not melatonin, like you do. 5-6 years later, this became major breakthrough in heart science, and since then on, there were things like that, in fine detail. So that's how I connected and continued and working with Bill, and benefited from his wisdom about intuitives.
That's great.
And certainly trying to utilize it when I have some difficult patients to deal with.
Mm-hmm. I was sitting there thinking when you were describing the percentage of right and wrong, I would say that most that aren't considered intuitives are probably much worse than 75%. So these were the other way.
These were exceptional. These were really exceptional top people like Jack Schultz.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've got a question, if I may, Paul. I guess it kind of tries to use all of this non-local quantum consciousness, but bring it into kind of a more tangible space here. And, I really appreciated the kind of explanation of being, showing the complementary aspects, pulling all this together. But I think there's that constant feedback that's going on between individual and the environment, and life conditions playing such a big role in how we're able to learn and then model and then move forward. And so I've just been curious of how, if we focused on setting up basic life conditions for everyone on the planet that improve those basic life conditions, having food, shelter, a safe place to be, what sort of systemic effects does that have on the entire system? Where we can pull back and just give comfort and nutrition and those things, and then what happens on that macro level at that point?
Well, that I think would have major positive impact on mental health and the kind of non-ordinary states of consciousness that people would start experiencing. But this may be the worst possible time to ask this question, because the environment is changing in all possible ways, from economic to financial. And it's so hard to know. I'm sure there are solutions, but at this point, it's hard to see what's going to happen. I think what is clear that we need to change. We need to change the situation on the planet. And it seems to me also clear that it has to be changed in two ways. One is on the outside, and one is on the inside. And the changes on the outside are more difficult to envisage right now because of the fluidity and difficulty to predict what the systems are going to be like. It seems to me that we live in a time of some fairly radical changes that's going to take place in the society for a variety of reasons. The change on the inside is clear. We have to work on ourselves. And if, for example, in the non-ordinary states, you experience what many teachers have been talking about, if you experience what intuition also shows us, that at the deeper level, we are all connected, then the solutions are very different and much easier. If I know that by hurting you, I hurt myself, it's a very different way of thinking about strategies, how to change the situations.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, I guess it's that internal look really was where we can focus, because that is imagine just that new mythology or new paradigm that comes out of that would dramatically change the planet.
But it has to be full experience of the deep connectedness that we have among ourselves. It cannot be just words. It cannot
just
be
words. Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
That direct experience.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Maybe we'll open it up to the audience that's tuned in. Matt, do you have any questions that have come in that you'd like to send towards Paul?
Got an interesting one here from Christian. And anyone feel free to chime in, but have psychedelics been used in stuff related to martial arts?
I don't know. I don't know.
I don't know specifically, but I know some of the discipline behind some of the most ancient martial arts would probably shy away from any sort of psychedelics or mind-altering chemical. However, I do know a few practitioners that the whole point is to understand energy flows, right? In and out of your own body. And I think it's an easy connection to make if people understand that the psychedelic experience and non-ordinary states can give you a very firsthand experience of what those look like, and almost a way to train with that energy around you at all times, and see it and perceive it and move it. And so I don't know if there has been any, but I would imagine that some are out there doing that.
Well, I have 2 points. One is certainly what the masters of martial arts describe when they are very effective. It sounds very much like non-ordinary states, and where they really perceive intuitively the target and so on. And so it would make sense that it should be possible to use psychedelics, but it would require particular technology to use that. But it would make sense to do that. The second point, Stan in his book, when the impossible happens, I think there's several examples of masters that came to SLM and practiced during his workshops. And I think that would be a good way to, if you're interested in the question, that would be a good way to start reading.
I think, in fact, I remember one story, correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, one of these individuals covered his eyes, and then he had a very sharp sword, and somebody was holding a melon, and he did, from a distance of, 20 something feet, he do a somersault, or he did some sort of movement
Yeah.
and then slice the melon perfectly, not touching the individual. So he held his awareness of that space and his relationship to it, and felt what he needed to do.
Yeah, that's exactly the story I'm thinking about to start with.
Yeah.
Interesting question. Thank you, Matt and Christian. Yeah.
Yes. We've got another one from a number of people that all seem to be chiming in on the subject of the relation of DMT and the pineal gland and dreaming. Some people are wondering, is DMT secreted by the pineal gland? Is that a rumor or myth? And what is its relation, if so, to dreaming? And if not, maybe what insight is there on dreaming to offer? Thank you.
Insight on dreaming in what way?
If it's
maybe endogenous DMT.
Right.
I know there's been a lot of speculation on that, and sorry to jump in there, but I know that Dr. Rick Strassman, that did a lot of that did the early research with DMT,
yes, he
had
did.
some hypothesis about, but I don't think that we have actually shown that DMT is actually produced by the pineal yet. However, I think he did find it in mice a few years ago. So that would probably indicate that we do as well. We do have the precursors to DMT in the pineal and in the brain. So it's very likely, but there has been just speculation on dreaming DMT connection in the pineal, but seems solid to me.
Dreaming certainly is a interesting non-ordinary state that you can use. Particularly lucid dreaming, I think, has great value as access to the invisible world around us. I remember when we were in Kashmir in ashram, there was an old teacher, and he very much stressed that this is a dreaming really is a gate to the invisible world that you can use to enter without any other technology. As far as DMT and pineal, I don't think there is any conclusive. I'm not aware of any conclusive, but interestingly, 2 days ago, somebody sent me the new full copies on pineal, so I'll look at it. And if you want to send me an email, I can tell you if there's anything new there.
Amazing. Cool. Well, hopefully that answers some of y'all's questions. We have another here. Find it again. Can psychedelics help people with obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD?
Yes, I think certainly. Well, first of all, I would depend on the type of OCD. There are OCD can be outcome of different processes. It can be just secondary to depression, or it could be secondary to psychosis, or it can be a neurotic state, or occasionally, I think some organic changes in the brain start manifesting with obsessive symptoms. So it would depend. But as far as the first two types, certainly psychedelics have been used effectively. The problem is people with obsessive-compulsive syndrome usually require much higher doses that are resistant to the average doses of psychedelics. So it's a hard work.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting, yeah.
Very cool. Does anyone know here about non-duality? Someone named Bisma here says, the purpose of a psychedelic is to attain a state of non-duality, advaita, as it is known in Sanskrit. If you can discuss using psychedelics as a tool of consciousness studies. So
well,
non-duality, I guess, would be what I'm interested in. in learning.
Unity.
Yes.
Unity. Yep.
Well, I think a number of people with me would agree if I said that the psychedelics is a royal road to studying states of consciousness. Certainly opened to us completely new vistas in that direction. Sorry, what was the other part?
They were curious about non-duality, but I think you also addressed that earlier. Is this unitive state of consciousness?
Yes.
As also related to Mitch's question, what's it going to take, for us to make this shift?
Well, I think under ordinary states of consciousness, the mind has tremendous need to split things in two, yes and no, black and white. And certainly, I think as Robin Harris Carhart showed, when in psychedelic states, the experiences of ego are essentially erased. You stop splitting things. It's also, you also feel one with the whole environment. So I think the need for duality disappears.
Yeah. And I think the latter part of that question there is like, can't, psychedelics be used as almost a training modality or experiential technology, as you were saying, Paul, to give us opportunities to experience that firsthand. And so in a way, it can have a huge impact on that. And
sure,
from my own personal experiences, that ultimately, as you work through the process of going through altered states, you can start to regularly jump to those places a little quicker and be able to almost just flow right into it. And it can help train even in your consensus reality that we exist in on a day-to-day basis.
No, I think psychedelics leads you beyond duality. Certainly one of the mechanisms is, of course, the default mode network gets either the effect is reduced or eventually eliminated. I think at that point you lose that feeling of divisions.
And you were also, along that line in our interview, Paul, I remember asking you if the oscillatory patterns that are experienced in a peak moment that during a psychedelic experience, for example, that those are patterns. You described how a flashback is, even after the substance is no longer in the system, the brain can revisit those peak moments or those peak waves. And so in that way, I've found that perhaps not to the degree in a psychedelic or in a session, but I can kind of revisit that pathway or that wave that I had. Is that correct? A way of
absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. And it's fascinating because that happens at the time when any chemical impact is long gone. It's only the tail of the oscillation, that is associated with the flashback. Yet it can be very powerful.
And I want to bring us back. We were talking about fields of consciousness earlier, and the importance of dream states as a gate to this invisible world. And Stan has told a story, and I was listening to your version of that story earlier today. You were talking about in China. You were in China for a period of a couple of weeks, I believe, traveling all
2.5 weeks.
Yeah. And so after one of your presentations, or maybe it was a breathwork session, someone came to you with their mother. Can you tell that story?
Yeah, it's helpful sometimes to think about the most extraordinary situations that you experience, where the invisible world kind of manifested. And for me, those two situations are experiencing in Brazil, Arrigo, the surgeon of Rusty Knife, and treating 900 patients. And this experience in China, and my recollection is that after one of the holotropic sessions, one of the participants came and told Stan that her grandmother had a dream. Grandmother who has not known holotropic breathwork, never knew about Stan, but had a dream, and in the dream, the ancestors told her that a particular relic, the particular piece of nature that they should actually give to Stan, that in her mind, it actually belongs to him. And so she then brought it, and it was this nautilus, this kind of trilobite that you can find at very high in Himalayas. Obviously, some of the Chinese went there and picked it up there, and obviously these are remnants there from millions of years ago when the Indian Ocean pushed Himalayas up, and therefore things from the ocean floor get into 7,000-8,000 meters up there. And the particularly funny thing is, the nautilus is something that Stan chose, I don't know how many years ago, as a symbol for holotropic breathwork, and I think also the International Transpersonal Association.
Yeah.
So when you see this, how can you possibly doubt fields and non-local consciousness?
Well, it's exciting to think that fields of science, psychology in particular, is opening to this idea, which is the basis of transpersonal psychology, really, isn't it? That
yes,
we are spiritual beings, and there are dimensions of consciousness that we are also part of and can access, and that impact us.
Yeah. I should probably hedge a little bit, and what I said, the three examples from our research, I don't see that as a proof of non-local consciousness, but I see it a proof that the hypothesis that these things are coming from the brain is wrong.
Good enough for now.
Yeah.
That'll work.
Oh, the rest we're gonna leave the next generation.
Yeah.
Figure out.
And the multiple disciplines, I think, that are coming to similar conclusions, psychology, but then getting over to information system from quantum mechanics and all of these different studies or areas of study that seem to be going, there are information fields that we're existing in, and the universe potential.
No, I wish we had 3 hours to really put these things together, because I realize that for somebody who has not experienced some of these things, it creates big questions in his mind. In my mind, it created questions for many decades about when all these things came together. Then, you can have all kinds of theories. Any scientist can. Eventually, if you're a scientist, you have to account for facts. And the facts on this seem to be very clear.
Lovely. Matt, are there any other questions?
Yes, there is one more, which I think is very interesting. Your insight would be very helpful for this person, probably. He said here that he has a, let me find it one more time. It started scrolling on me. Okay, his name is Luke, and he says, I have schizoaffective disorder and bipolar, and used to think I was spiritually awakened, and since medication, he feels a loss of spirituality.
Yeah, I think you could search for somebody who understands that these things can happen at the same time. And it's important to realize that on the one hand, the schizoaffective state can complicate your life and functioning in the life. On the other hand, the fact that you have spiritual elements in it can be worked for your benefit and can lead you to the changes that you need to make in your life to make it productive and meaningful.
Yeah, it's a fine line to walk to be able to make sure somebody's safe.
It is very, very common. In my experience, for the past 30 years, paying clear attention to it, it's the spiritual content, the spiritual experiences come more often tied up with some emotional disturbance than just the completely pure, the kind of blessing of a pure spiritual awakening, mystical experience without any contamination with some unusual psychological phenomena. It just requires somebody who understands that, who's going to work with you and works through that and makes the benefit of the spiritual content.
That was really, I'm glad that question was asked.
Yes, it's an important one.
Mm-hmm. That also speaks to spiritual emergence, which you were saying is another possibility of these extreme peaks, that things can be bubbling up. And if it's misunderstood or misdiagnosed, then it's an opportunity for transformation that was also missed.
Yeah. Well, I think at that time, it's a matter of timing. At that time, the mind is more open to those situations. It's easier to reach them when the activity of the brain, when the oscillations are at its peak.
And just one quick question, Paul. I know I've asked you this before, and I think that it has to do with astrology. And in our interview, you mentioned that it was the moment of conception that should determine a person's chart, that you had, through your experience, come to understand as the most valuable. But that the idea of planetary transits, have you come across any research where there's some correlation between planetary transits and these periods of peak activity in the brain?
We have a study going in that direction, but it's very difficult. I don't think I'll be able to proceed with that. Let me just clarify one thing. That was the intuitives who said, not me. I don't know that much about astrology, but the Bill Kautz asked the intuitive consensus, about astrology, and they said, well, if you want to use it really productively, you have to shift and you have to start looking at the time of birth and the chart. I did some number of years ago. Did a study with Jungian trained astrologer, and of course, she was trained in the deterministic astrology, not the archetypal astrology. And so I had this clinical course data. So I gave her data from 20 patients and all the timing of the episodes of non-ordinary states that happened naturally, and she came back very enthusiastic and said, this is fabulous. I can explain every of the episodes. And she sat down and episode after episode, showed me what the astrological setup was and how it wonderfully explains it. And then I told her, this is great. Look, but I have lifelong courses. I have from each of the patients, I have one more episode. Can you predict, if you know so well these 10, can you tell me about when the 11 is going to? Oh, yes. I get it. She was wrong in all 20 cases. It's, I think you would have to use the archetypal approach. I think the deterministic astrology, I think, has, from this experience, seems to me kind of a limited application. So we are now trying to do something, but it's one problem is all our patients are either doing so well that we cannot see additional episodes, or are having very non-episodic chronic course of their problems. It's just not suitable. So we are progressing very slowly.
Susan, is there anything else you want to go into, or questions before we wrap up?
Well, maybe one last question, because I have a friend whose sister suffers from manic depressive bouts, and I know we were talking about lithium, and that over years it has a detrimental effect on vital organs in the body. And I seem to remember you were at one point talking about the idea of periodic dosing, which of course you'd have to have some sense of when these episodes might be coming on. But is that an approach that you do as opposed to just constant?
Yes. Yeah. No, I mean, you saw one example on the slide.
Yeah.
You know, first of all, the problem with lithium is it's very often used inappropriately and wrongly. One has to make a very strong difference. And this happened because in the 60s, late 60s and around 1970, when we started using lithium, the people who respond, it looked like a miracle. You know, when the physician had a patient who has been 20 times in the hospital for 4 or 5 months, a year, and suddenly goes on lithium, and a year, 2, 5, 20, the patient's stable. It looks unbelievable. And so people started trying it on practically all psychiatric conditions. This is, you cannot prescribe lithium based on the symptom set. You have to get to know the patient. You have to get to know profile. You have to get to know the person to identify that it's a correct treatment. And then the effect on the body is very minimal. I mean, 80% of the patients tell you that they don't think they are taking any medication. They're just stable. But if it's used wrongly, wrong patients, wrong dosage, then there are side effects. And of course, on top of that, if the patient is not responding, then people are pushing for higher dosage, and that of course complicates the situation. But the effect on the kidney, on the glomerular filtration, is real, particularly after decades of treatment, and that can the data we have at this point suggests that by intermittent treatment you can completely avoid it.
Wow. Well, thank you, Paul. I'm so glad that you joined us today to add some additional clarity to our interview. And I also want to thank you personally for your support in this project. You've been really wonderful in supporting my efforts and my work with Stan. So thank you. And
it's been a pleasure. And as I said, I'm grateful to you that you came up with this idea for me to try to look at Stan's and my work together, because forced me to kind of organize it in a some presentable way. And And I'm also very grateful to Stephen and Mitch and Matt for putting this together and helping me to fix my technology so that we could communicate this way. And of course, you hopefully are clear that when you do research over so many years, it's a collective. And I'm not talking about Professor Duffy and Elda and all the other people who've worked with me on this. And finally, of course, I'm very grateful to Stan. He's just been amazing, brother, and I'm just very, very grateful. And I don't think without his influence, I would have been able to get this far in this particular area, in this particular dimension.
Wonderful.
It's amazing.
Well,
thank you so much, Paul.
Yeah.
It was an absolute honor, and I'm sure we'll be seeing you again soon. So thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure.
All right. Bye, Paul. Yeah. And I just want to say before we say goodbye to everybody that next week, Bill Melton will be joining us. And Bill was with Stan and Paul in China years ago. And Bill has an amazing perspective to share as well. So anyway, much love to everybody, and be well, wear a mask, protect yourselves. All right. Take care.
Bye, everybody. Have a good day. Bye-bye.